Hi everyone, I'm Kaylee Bateman from Mixing Light, and I'm here today talking with Aurora Shannon, who's a colorist at Company 3 in Vancouver. We met each other many years ago now when she trained me when I was working for DNEG. We both worked there at the same time, and I was really fortunate to be trained by Aurora. She's extremely clever and has an amazing eye. So she taught me everything I know about VFX colouring, and I'm extremely grateful to her. And I'm talking to her today about the work that she's been doing with Company 3, but also the other work that she's doing as a mentor to up-and-coming filmmaker colorists, and as well sort of how she got her start and where her amazing career has taken her so far. So recently I've watched a few things that Aurora's graded, and they're absolutely beautiful. Some recent series work that she's been doing through Company 3 are shows like Sweet Magnolias and Under the Bridge, and they're both absolutely stunning. They've got gorgeous contrast, they've got beautiful saturation levels. So yeah, why don't we start there? I would love to know anything you're able to share about the grades for those programs.
So they're both really, really nice shows to work on. They're both quite feminine shows. Like Sweet Magnolia is about these three women who are best friends who live in this fictional small town, which is like it's essentially it's a fantasy of American suburban life. And they have their ups and their downs, but it's always good at the end of the day, kind of thing. Under the Bridge, in some ways, is almost the complete contrast. It's about a group of teenage girls. It's set about a really horrific true story that happened here in British Columbia, and it's almost the total opposite. It's not wholesome. It's teenage friendship gone bad, gone very, very as bad as it can get. So you've got these two kind of very contrasting stories, but what they both have is they both have this quite beautiful, gentle, feminine cinematography, and that's just what we follow through in the grade. So for both of those shows, they both have their own bespoke LUTs, which is obviously the starting point of any LUT. The Sweet Magnolia, it was a LUT that I inherited. It was my first project here, season 3, when I came to Company 3 Vancouver. And it's a very soft, just the right amount of contrast, just the right amount of saturation, warmer tone. It is shot and set in Georgia. So it's got that warm Southern American tone. And that was developed by the DP Brian Johnson with Colour for the show. Both are HDR shows. So obviously we had a HDR version of that. And then the LUT for Under the Bridge is a bespoke Company 3 LUT. I'm not going to say which, but it's featured on quite a few Company 3 shows as a starting point for the development. So you start with that LUT, and then it gets developed towards that vision. In this case, the main creative is the EP and the show creator, Quinn, who also directed a couple of the episodes. And this is, I kind of don't really like using the word filmic because film is a format. It's not a colour palette. But it is that typical filmic kind of Kodak look, so the story is set in the 90s. Yeah. In the 90s, if you went to cinema, your film would be shot and projected to you in celluloid. So I think it was really, she really wanted the film to not only be set in the 90s, look like it's in the 90s, but almost feel like you're watching something from the 90s. And the attention to detail is amazing. So as someone who grew up in the 90s, I'm like, I had that. It really, really is quite amazing. But again, she had this really, really dark story, and it would have been so easy to go dark with it, and she didn't. She wanted to go soft and feminine. She wanted to have those moments of femininity there in the cinematography and in the grade. And there are all these pastel tones throughout, so pinks and yellows and blues and mints, and wherever it is in the art direction of the cinematography, it was just my job to let it come through and emphasize it.
Well, I think you succeeded beautifully. It's got that lovely softness to it, but it also has this gorgeous curve that has a real contrast through the mids. So the skin always looks right. It always looks dimensional and 3D, and yet the shadows never get, too low.
Yeah, I've begun to describe one of the things that's really nice about working for a company like Company 3 is you just have this catalogue of love. It's extraordinary thing to have at your disposal. And when I've, rather it just being like, this is the show, this is the lot, use it. You're actually picking and developing the lot. And I've begun to talk in very untechnical terms about LUTs in terms of thickness and thinness. It's something I feel like I've become quite sensitive to. And I think it's what you're alluding to is sometimes you feel like, okay, it's low contrast, but I'm not feeling it. There's kind of not something in the middle of there's not this richness in the middle of the image.
Mm.
It kind of, to me, the only way I can describe it is it feels kind of thin. And then on the other hand, sometimes
I
they
totally
feel too
understand.
thick. It's like, well, I'm looking at my waveform and it's flat, but it doesn't look flat, or it doesn't feel flat.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I completely understand what you're saying there with the thickness. It's got like a real presence to it, and it's got a density in the colors, and yeah, just stunning. So when you work with those LUTs, are you working underneath or over or a
So
combination?
I tend to always have my LUT at the very end. So I'm always working underneath my LUT, obviously, unless it's an input LUT. But I tend to always have it at the very end. And I've also beginning any grain. So under the bridge, we use grain extensively throughout it, and actually different types of grain. We don't actually change the LUT or the color palette or even the look that much, because we go back in time. We go to the 70s, we go to the 50s. We have even flashback sequences within the 90s. So we use grain to try to signal to the audience that this was a different time, but without doing a really obvious look. So one of the things that I was playing around with is, do I put my grain before or after the look? And what I really came to the conclusion with on this show is, I think now I prefer it after the lock. So I'd go
Mhm.
grey, lock, grain.
Yeah, perfect. So those texture elements aren't being given the same curve as the color elements. That kind of makes sense in terms of, if it was a celluloid process, how it would kind
Yeah.
of work. It's just, yeah, gorgeous work. So with the Sweet Magnolias, where you inherited the look, was it a matter of kind of working out what the color journey of the previous seasons was and staying quite close to that, or were you able to deviate a
Not
little
at
bit?
all. So Brian decided that he wanted a new look from season 3 going forward. He wanted a new look. This was the new look. So I actually graded episodes 1 and 2 to match the previous season, and we went to do the reviews and no, this isn't what I want. So, which was completely fine. It was a learning curve for me. It was literally my first job. It was my second week.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, that before you start a phone call with the DP is really important. But so it's a totally new look. And honestly, you know, Brian knows what he wants. So the lot was what he wanted. The CDLs were what he wanted. I mean, I was, for the most part on that show, I'm really just polishing the CDL. Like, I'm polishing the CDLs. I'm, you know, just some windows to bring down the light. He's very sensitive to anything he feels is overlit or studio lighting or anything like that. A few little fixes here and there. I don't think it's a show I can take very much credit for.
Well, I think that sometimes knowing when not to do something can be actually harder.
Yes, it does
So
require
takes great amount of
a
taste.
very light touch. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. And so for those listening, the CDLs are the files that come from set. And so if you've listened to the interview that I did with Fergus Halley, who is an amazing dailies colorist out here, he or a dailies colorist would be grading everything on set and usually having conversations with the DP around that. And then we're seeing here what happens in the DI. Sometimes those CDLs are blown away, but sometimes, and ideally, really, they're brought into the DI and used either as inspiration or as a starting point.
Yeah. So I will always use the CDLs for a starting point if I feel that they're useful. And I think almost all of the time they are useful, particularly when you're doing the dailies and the finishing as part of the same company and you've been able to be part of that initial kind of camera test, look there, set the lot before the daily starts. Is, for me personally, why would I not use it? You know, like, it's work.
Oh, absolutely.
It's been done. Someone spent time on this. It's been paid for. And for me personally, I feel it really does just give you that head start.
And it's sort of when the system works, you know, because that's the idea, isn't it? That's why people do dailies. It's not to throw it away. It's not just, you know, lip service to the production. It's actually to start that creative thought. And, you know, when it works, it does carry through, and those conversations from the very beginning become part of the end.
It does. And also, I think I mean, this isn't the main reason, but it is a nice consequence of it. You know, it's so much nicer for the people doing the dailies knowing that their work is being used and not just being thrown away. And, you know, when I'm in early to get a head start and they're leaving a bit later and we cross paths, I can be like, you know, yeah, we're using the CDLs and they're great. Thank you. You know?
And that's part of coming up in this industry, isn't it? Because a lot of people cut their teeth in dailies. And when you get a chance to get that kind of feedback, I imagine it's quite satisfying, and it also gives you a chance to help them if it's not landing. If you don't get that feedback, how are you meant to improve?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if I had my way, and I've discussed it, but it's just not possible, I think, from a scheduling point of view. You know, I would hand the project over to them first to kind of, you know, almost like finish their job, you know, their part. Because they do a tremendously good job. But obviously, when you're grading entire takes rather than whatever seconds get picked in the cut, it's never going to be perfect, you know. But it doesn't mean that they can't do once they've got it.
Oh, well, it's a lovely idea, and hopefully the scheduling works out and you can do that at some point. And I think that just goes towards your nature as a mentor and somebody who's very, very good at training people. I've been on the other side of that, and you've got a real skill for it. So while we're talking about it, can you tell me a little bit about the mentoring that you're doing through your old university and also through the Vancouver Post Alliance?
So I was very, very lucky. I got to go to Ravensbourne, which is part of University London now, in the UK, really, really good university, I owe a huge, huge debt to. I wouldn't have even known that colour grading existed, or the lab where I first started existed, if I hadn't have gone there. And they're really lucky to have the same tutors that I have, so they're still there. They have
Great.
several mentoring schemes, and I've participated in several of them. The big one at the moment is called Seeds. So it's for people, I'm not sure exactly what it stands for. It's basically with people, additional barriers entering the industry. So it could be minority, it could be neurodivergence, it could be disability, for example. Just people that need a little bit of extra bespoke guidance just for them. But I've also done a lot of unofficial mentoring. Like, I don't want to get completely undated, but I usually reply to every message I get on LinkedIn, for example. And, you know, I usually, especially when I was in London, was going for a lot of coffees. Because I get bored and I like to talk to people. So if people usually ask me for a coffee, I'll go for one. So I did a lot of unofficial mentoring, and I also did a lot for other students at Ravensbourne, unofficially as well. And I'm now doing the same thing here in Vancouver via the Vancouver Post Alliance. So their mentoring is a little bit different. It's usually for people who are a few more years into their career than students or graduates. I've got to be honest, it's probably students and graduates who enjoy mentoring most. Just because I feel like there's more advice to give, and the advice makes a bigger impact, you know?
I understand completely. You're taking them from the exponential curve, you know, it's really, really sharp. But whereas when you get a little bit further on, your gains are smaller.
Or sometimes it's like, yeah, just hold on in there. And that's all you
Yeah, keep going.
But there's a few things that I've noticed that kind of a bit the do's and don'ts. So one of the things that I've noticed, unfortunately, is I feel a lot of young people are getting not the best advice from their universities on, let's say, for example, somebody wants a job, they want to become a colorist, and they want to do it, what I guess now is the old-fashioned way of assistant colorist, you know, maybe client services at IO, assistant colorist, junior colorist, dailies, VFX colorist, you know, the kind of path that we've both taken. And what a lot of these colleges and universities tell them to do is to send a CV out saying that they are a colorist. And it's all about the demo reel. And I met this young one woman, so for a whole year, she'd been trying to get a job in London. It's just a runner, like anything. And she couldn't. And she was convinced it was because her reel wasn't good enough. And I was explaining to her, no one cares what your reel looks like. Like at that point, when you're like wanting to enter the industry, to get a job, to then get a job as an assistant colorist, it's nice if you have one. You know, it shows an interest. Probably no one's even going to look at it. What I want from you is a CV that shows me you can hold down a job. So put your 1 year of working at Tesco's in there, because that shows you turned up and followed instructions and held down a job for a year. And I want to know what your skill set is. Do you know what time code is? Do you know what frame rates are? Do you know what raw camera codecs are? You know, can you import and export a CDL or an EDL? What software do you know? Rate? Do you have an understanding? Have you used it? How much have you used it? And really what this is all the skills that I'm looking for in an assistant colorist. All the skills that I'm going to have to teach that assistant colorist if they don't already have them. So I get a CV like that, and it's the same for assistant editor jobs as well. I can look at that and say, I can have them where I need them in 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 2 months. When I get a CV that says I've graded 12 music videos, I have no clue as that person's actual technical skills. I've got no idea how long it's
Mm.
going to take to train. If they're graded 12 music videos as well, great. That kind of indicates what their usage of that software package has been. But it's almost a checklist. So anyway, I gave her this advice. She redid her CV. She sent it to me. Yeah, that's great. It was 2 or 3 weeks later, she was offered a job at Ennsby as an assistant colorist. Not as a runner.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So, and it was frustrating for me because I see this, she's just been given the wrong advice, you know?
Mm.
And with the right advice she got immediately, because she had every skill. I'm like, I want you as my assistant colorist. You know, she had all the skills, but to her, she also wasn't valuing. You know, she didn't know
Mm.
that this list of skills actually has a value because it's just normal, right? You just import it, you export it.
Mm.
You know, it's not necessarily this big thing, but it is, but it might not feel like it, you know?
Yeah, and I think that's something that people who know quite a bit fall for all the time, is that the more you know, the less you think you know because you're aware of what you don't know. Whereas if you just know like one tiny little thing, you're like, I'm an expert.
Yeah, and then the other thing is the reels. Like I said, at that point in your career, a reel probably doesn't really, it's not that important.
Mm.
Obviously, if you're a freelancer trying to get work, especially commercials work, then it's absolutely vital. It's your bread and butter. But I was talking to some other colorists about, okay, so you're applying for a job as an assistant colorist. You have the opportunity to submit a reel. Of course you want to submit it because you want to take that opportunity to show your work. Well, what is a useful reel? Because the other thing I
Mm.
then find is the reels. I'm like, okay, there's a series of images. I've got no idea what they are. I've got no idea what they look like. I don't know what you've done to them. I don't even know how many projects. I literally can't make any assessment of skill from this. Whereas if you have a reel where, let's say, you have a slower reel, again, this is for assistant colorist work, not colorist work. Let's say you have 4 or 5 shots taken from a scene and next to each other in the scene. Now I know if you can balance and match shots, right? I
Mm.
can look at that and say, very good. Now let's say we have a longer form project and you've taken a shot from each scene and you put them next to each other and be like, oh, you've made a number of variations of the same look, which are both different, and another skill set has been demonstrated. Then you have some mishmash of lots of different looks from lots of different. Like, yeah, okay, yeah, you can do loads of different ways. I've got some sense, and I've also had enough time on each project. I think sometimes there's this idea that shows have to be really, really quick and really fast paced.
Mm.
But sometimes I do feel it's good to give people a moment to actually register what it is that you've worked on. And even if it's just 3 or 4 projects, that's fine, that's okay.
I mean, I think some of the things that you've covered there are really interesting. So, in terms of the skill set of an assistant colorist, it's less about that artistic, creative kind of vision, which you can develop over time and you can develop your eye and you can develop those techniques. But it seems that you're sort of saying that the more fundamental things there are matching, balancing, consistency, being able to work to a brief. Like these things are quite technical and dry, and you're not necessarily going to learn them on your own doing music videos in your bedroom.
What I see is, so when I started, there was only one way to become a colorist. That was to join a company like Company 3 as a runner, work your way up, try and get in the grading suite, get a position as an assistant colorist. That was the only way to do it because there was no kit at home. You couldn't do it at home. There were no courses. There were no online resources. That was the only way you could do it. Now, there are these two pathways. There's this old school pathway, which still very much exists. There's this newer pathway where you can do these online courses. You can use online resources. There's so much content being made. There's so many content producers. You know, I see students working on advertisements for social media for really big brands and they're getting paid for it, you know? So there's this other pathway as well, and they both have pros and cons. The con of that second pathway from the work that I see is the discipline, the consistency, the balancing, the matching, all that really, really boring stuff is not impossible, but it's harder to learn because where are you learning it from? You haven't got a senior or a mentor. You're not sitting in a chair, you know, checking shots, comparing new VFX shots against old VFX shots, and then matching the new VFX shots in or doing dailies. You don't have that experience. Again, it's not to say you can't have a career going that way. Lots of people are and do, but I do tend to see it steered more towards the short form.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. Because also in short form, you can use a lot of maneuvers to get somewhere, but in long form, there's often restrictions on the workflow. So if you're working on CDLs, you've got your 10 values and you can't go outside of that. There's no secondaries, you can't muck around and go, oh, I'll go cool this way and then warm that way and then I'll come back to the center. You just have to go straight to the goal. And same when, we were VFX coloring, there were restrictions around what tools you could use and how you could implement them. So you had to get really good at getting straight to the point. You couldn't kind of meander around to get to a good balance.
And and this is one of the most challenging parts I found of going from a junior, the biggest challenge I had as a junior colorist, having come up via assistant colorist in a DI finishing environment, which at the time was quite unusual. Usually it was more typical to be in a dailies environment, was I had a client next to me telling me what they wanted, validating what I had done, like a grade, no problem. But the moment I didn't have that person next to me, I didn't know what to do. Like, I've got an image, I've got the tools. How should it look? I don't know. Does it match? Well, I kind of think it does. It does on the waveform, but does it? Is it good? No idea. and then that was a lack of experience, right? That was a lack of time in the chair, and specifically time in the chair alone. And that's one of the reasons why I went into the effects grading, because I knew I was going to get that time. I was going to be forced. I was going to be forced to figure it out by myself.
So let's talk about that start of your career and how you came up in the DI suite as an assistant. I mean, we've talked about this previously, and you've got some amazing stories of the people that you worked with at the time, and the rooms that you were in are pretty phenomenal. So anything you can share about that, I'd love to hear.
So I had probably the most extraordinary timing and luck I've ever heard of at the start of my career. I was doing work experience at a small laboratory off of Wardour Street in London. And I went there because they had the lab timers, the telecine colorist, and the DI colorist. It was the only place that had it. I was like, this is where I'm going. where I'm going to learn. So I went there and a runner walked out. They didn't even walk out, they just texted that they quit. And I asked for her job. And the guy who became my boss didn't really want to give me the job. I think he thought I was a bit of a precocious brat, which I probably was.
Nothing wrong with that.
But anyway, he was kind of desperate, so he gave me the job. And my tutors were like, yeah, sure, just as long as you submit your work. I had a term left on my degree. Go work. This is the point of the course. So I was supposed to be looking after the telecine suites, but of course I didn't want to be in the telecine suites. I wanted to be in the DI suite. So I was always in the DI suite. And the first colorist I assisted was Robin Pizzey, who is just an absolute phenomenal legend of a colorist. And he was doing, or they were doing, this was like just a room in the back of a lab that almost everyone ignored. I knew what was in there. No, none of the other runners knew or cared. So I was in there and I was talking to him, and then Quantum of Solace comes up. So this room in the back of this lab becomes Company 3 London. Eventually, it goes through a few names first, but it's associated. And he basically, I think he wanted me as an assistant colorist, but he basically says, we're going to need our own client services. This was the end, this was the excuse. So then I became their own dedicated client services. Then Laurent Trehan, the colour scientist, technical director, was like, I'm not having you sit around making cups of tea. He gets me in the scanning and recording room, and I'm doing all the densitometer readings, and I'm changing lab rolls for the lasers, and I'm lacing the ARRI scanner. So I'm having a whale of a time. So much fun. I've just about graduated, not even had the ceremony. And then it's like, right, you're going to be Stefan Nakamura's colour assistant. He's coming over to finish Quantum of Solace, and he has to have an assistant. Now, I have no assistant skill set whatsoever. I don't know how to do anything on Resolve because it's fine. Just go sit next to him. So my job as assistant colorist was essentially just to almost just sit there and talk. But of course, in all of that, I just absorbed so much information. And he has, one thing Nakamura has is the most phenomenal, he has a huge amount of skills and talent. But one thing he has is the most phenomenal work ethic. You know, you want to work on these kind of films, this is the work ethic that you have to have, right? And so he really impaired that on me. And yeah, it was just extraordinary just watching this film being made from the very start, you know, literally the lab rolls of film coming in and being scanned to the very end, sitting with him, and he actually taught me how to calculate how on or off aim the print was, and I'm sitting there with my bit of paper. So it was unbelievably lucky. It's almost like doing a master's or something. But at that point, then that was it. I was an assistant colorist. I was able to assist Rob Pizzey on many films. I think I did another one with Nakamura. I did a couple with Stefan Sonnenfeld. I did one with Mitch Paulson. Yeah, and then later we were joined by Adam Glassman. And then later from that, it was a junior then, but Greg Fisher and Paul Ennsby. So, yeah, it's like a really amazing,
unbelievable
group of people. And it's not just the colorist, but it's also, you know, Laurent was an amazing technical director. Then I was joined by John Cortell, who is an absolute legend. I think even Academy Award-winning color scientist. You'd never know to meet him. He's so humble, but he is. And then, so it's engineers and it's editors and then the client. So, like sitting in a room next to Anthony Mantle, who's basically telling you how he sets up his shop for lighting. And then the next day, someone's like, oh, he's doing a talk at the BFI and it's only £30. And I'm like, sitting in a suite with him all afternoon. Why would I pay £30 to go? But I was realising moments like that, you really realise what you're just getting as just part of your kind of daily working life and stuff that people would, go out for the evening to go and listen to.
But that's just absolutely the best start anyone can hope to have. And I think it really speaks volumes about what you get as an assistant and why working for bigger companies, even if it takes a little while to get to that goal, is a really solid way to get there. Because you learn so much, clearly. You get so many opportunities to understand different parts of the process, and you get a chance to get good at it without all of the responsibility being on your shoulders. Because you hear stories about people getting an amazing chance, but it's very sink or swim. And I think it really depends on the day of the week for anyone, whether or not they've got the ability to get through that kind of it's not a sustainable way to work.
It's not me. I just know that's not me. That whole being a freelancer, particularly trying to learn your craft and develop your status and your profile as a freelancer, that is not me. It's not my personality. I know it's not. I did have a moment. So I left Company 3 after about 7 years. I just hit a ceiling where it's like, I'm not going forward. I'm not learning anything. If anything, I kind of feel like I'm drifting backwards, because ultimately you can only progress as far as the work that there is and the work that's available to you. And I was in that spot I think a lot of people can find themselves in, where you're like, well, I'm too experienced to just be doing assistant work. I'm too ambitious. Like, I want to do more and I can do it, but I can't do that just yet. Like, there's got to be something in between. And it was a really good time to be a freelancer in London because the kit had just become available, but very few people knew how to use it yet. So you could make a lot of dough. And I was just like, I'm tired. Like, I'm worn out. I'm tired. I don't want to be running my own business and invoicing people and chasing money and chasing work and going into one place one day and putting this hat on and go. And there was also this underlining thing of kind of just knew I wasn't quite like, I could probably blag it, I could probably do a good enough job, but I knew that there was a block missing my experience that I had to fill in first. And I think that's when I came back to finishing, I was still completely terrified. Like, that sink or swim feeling, I just don't think it ever leaves you. I get it at the start of every single show I do. I'm like, this is it. This is it. This is going to be the one that ruins me, you know? But I at least knew I had all of the pieces. I'm like, okay, I know I can do the client stuff. I know I can do the social stuff. I know I can do my balance. I know I can do my match. I know I can do my windows. I know I can. I've got all the pieces. I've just got to put it.
Yes, and I hate to bring it back to gender, but I have noticed, and I also have experienced this as a woman, is that sense of, I'm not ready, I need a little bit more, I need to be better educated, I need to get that experience first. Whereas I find that a lot of men will jump a little bit more like head first into those sink or swim moments. Like, even, hearing stories of people who don't know a grading system particularly well and just kind of talking their way into a suite and saying, oh, yeah, I can do it, no worries, I would be absolutely beside myself. I wouldn't be able to sleep at night. I'd have to go in for a month unpaid to get up to speed. And I don't know, like I hate to bring it back to gender, but I do think that there is a gendered element there of feeling confident and the point at which you just say, I'm good enough now. I'm going to do it. And I suspect that you were probably good enough at that point. But it's everything you did in between gave you even more.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the
So,
gender thing, I mean, there are literally studies that say that, you know, if a guy fulfills 40% of a job description, he'll apply for it. And if a woman, like 90, she won't because she's missing 10 or something. So there's definitely something there. It is always hard to know what's personality and what's gender. But there's also a little element of, and this was really when I was at DNEG. I spent a lot of time at DNEG. I was very happy there. I got to live a lot of life. I got to travel. I got to have weekends. It was wonderful. But there was also an element of I was waiting for the right opportunity. I kind of knew I could, and I don't want to be rude, but this is how it is. I could go down a level in caliber of work, and be a finishing colorist. I kind of knew that option was available to me. But I knew once I did that, it'd be really, really hard to get back up to what I actually wanted to work on. Same thing. You know, I spent longer being an assistant colorist before I became a junior. I probably could have gone down a level. There's always this option when you're working for like a top tier company or a top tier caliber production to go kind of down a level in caliber and up a level in job title. There's often always this option, and sometimes it's the right move to do, right? But for me personally, I never felt it was the right move. I felt like this is the caliber of work that I want to work on, and I'd rather have a lower job title and even probably substantially lower pay to be on that rather than, you know, to be in the top seat, but on something I don't really want to work on. And there's probably an element of status there as well, that the caliber of work that you work on, it gives you a certain.
sure. I mean, I feel like there are different worlds in a way. And you could either be like big fish in a small pond or a small fish in a big
Yeah.
pond. And you chose small fish in a big pond. But while you were that small fish, you were actually getting bigger and bigger and bigger and
Well,
bigger.
yes. And
So,
I sort of by chance and accident found myself being a bigger fish and actually in a bit of a smaller pond. So Vancouver is not a crowded market for colorists or colour grading. You know, there's ours, there's Picture Shop, both employ a max of 3 or 4 colorists at any one time. That is pretty much the population of finishing colorists of Vancouver. There's a couple of smaller companies. But again, you know, going back to this luck and timing, I just happened to physically be in Vancouver when they needed a colorist. And there kind of weren't any. Like, I'm not saying there weren't any other candidates, but you know, the big you know, if you're a dailies colorist, it's very easy to get shoehorned as you're a dailies. You're a VFX colorist, you're
yes.
a VFX colorist, that's what you do. You're an assistant, you're a junior. Like it's always an element of luck about how you come up to the next level. sometimes it's moving country. You know, I went from junior to VFX by, okay, it was an open job and a website, I applied for it, but I moved country. That's how I went up that level. And this was a case of being in the right place at the right time. And again, sorry to bring it back, but with a certain caliber of employment history and credit list, which
Yeah.
brings about an element of trust. You know, it's the same thing if I'm, you know, if I'm looking to hire an assistant colorist, or probably more now we're talking about a colorist, you know, I look at their CV and I'm like, oh, well, that was on the TV, right? So I know that they can work to that. That was in a cinema. I know they can work to that. That was from Netflix. I know they can work to that.
And I think at that level, there's more technical processes to understand and to, you know, shepherd the project through. You mentioned before that the two series that we discussed were HDR, SDR. So knowing those workflows, if you've done jobs that are for Netflix or Hulu or what have you, you're probably familiar with Dolby Vision workflows and HDRX10. You're on top of these new workflows and these new technologies that seem to be moving at lightning speed.
Yeah, and again, it's, you know, let's say you're someone, you've blagged your way into the suite, you've got your little box of tricks, you've made this thing look spectacular, you've got all the social skills and the client skills, and everyone loves you, and then it goes off and it gets rejected by the network. Every shot has a QC error. The HDR gets rejected on technical grounds. I mean, it'd be a complete and utter disaster.
Can you tell me a little bit about when you moved to Company 3 for the second time in Vancouver in your current title? I noticed that on one of the shows that you were on, My Big Fat Greek Wedding 3, that you were grading along with Stefan Sonnenfeld. Did you find that there were a lot of opportunities for learning these workflows and you know, obviously understanding the Company 3 way of doing things? Was that an enriching
Yeah,
experience for you?
so Under the Bridge is also a shared project with Stefan. So he did episode 1 and I did, or am doing 2 to 8. So one of the things I find at Company 3 is, in terms of like the editorial side of stuff, everything outside of the grading room, there is a Company 3 way of doing it, right? And of course it changes with technology, but it's pretty consistent, and it's pretty consistent globally, and it has to be because projects are just pinging all over. Inside the grading room, every colorist gets to grade how they grade. There is a lot of difference between how different grade. Even to things that you consider to be technical but still are subjective, like doing your Dolby Vision trick. You know, do you analyze each shot separately? Do you find one analysis you like for the scene on one shot and apply that? I heard something about someone analysing a grayscale chart and applying that to the whole thing. So, you know, there's
Wow.
the colorists have the freedom to work how they work. There's also a huge amount of opportunity to learn from other colorists as well. Sometimes you do an indie film and they want it to look like an indie film. Sometimes they want it to look like a glossy Hollywood film. Sometimes you do a glossy Hollywood film, they want it to look like an... And you're like, well, what do you mean look like an indie? Well, there are kind of things. So, you know, sometimes I want a little bit grungier, a little bit mushier, or whatever that kind of trend is, or something like that. But I have noticed the tendency, and is with these kind of higher budget, higher status, is the importance really, really, really seems to be on colour separation. Like that's if someone was to ask me what makes a Hollywood film from a color grading perspective, I would say it doesn't matter how strong the look is, it doesn't matter how grungy the blacks is, how indie a look they've gone, or how much they've dirtied it up in the LART or the dailies. When you look at that end result, you're going to have perfect color separation on every single.
That's a really great tip for anyone who's colouring, and it comes right back to those fundamentals of balancing, because when you have a well-balanced image, you can then do what you want to it because you've got that foundation there and you have created that colour separation. And you see it, on a parade if you get your scan or your original material and everything's in the red channel, and then you pull that down and pull some cyan back in, and all of a sudden everything just is
Or
revealed.
sometimes you go a bit further than that. There's an inherent color separation which is in a perfectly balanced shot, and then you can almost go for a slightly hyper, which is where you're actually separating the colors further. And one of the ways, really, really simple tip, is you just key your black. Like, key your blacks, put a bit of blue in them, pop. Now, if your shot isn't perfectly balanced, it's not gonna react in that way. The other thing is if you haven't learned how to match and balance, and actually you're using your keys to match your balance. I mean, I'm of the opinion there's only so many keys and windows you can put on an image until it just kind of falls apart or looks really digital and fake. So you kind of already used it up,
Yes. Yes, I call that overcooked. Yeah, I get there all the time, especially doing short form, because everyone from the agency is like, "Oh, that thing there and that thing there," and individually you go, "Okay, all of these are good corrections," but you step back and go, "Oh, it's really overcooked now, and it's really not tied to what was shot anymore." So I completely understand what you're saying there. And I think it comes back to that idea of complexity not being better than, like, sometimes you need to be complex, but in an ideal world, I don't think that adds anything.
Yeah,
Especially with material that's very well shot.
Yes. I mean, the difference between, I've done quite a variety of work and a wider variety of work in the last year and a half, as partly because of the strike. The strike really affected us here up in Vancouver. So I got to do a lot more indie work, and I mean like real indie work, which was great, and it was really amazing to work on some films with some really great stories. But they were more challenging to grade. Like, there is a big difference between something that's been shot with tens, if not 100 or something million plus dollars spent on it, and something which is grading with us because they want a voucher at a film festival. There's a big difference. But I think it is absolutely doable. If you know how to do the tools, it's doable. But yes, you've often got to do much more to the image, and you've got to do much more onto each individual image, and which is bespoke to each image.
Yeah. So having like a scene, instead of saying everything's already pretty good, you might need a bunch of windows or keys to just match one angle to another before you look at the scene as a whole.
Absolutely. But each one of those should have a point and purpose to them, which couldn't be achieved in a different one. At least for windows and keys. Some people like to be very, very clean and only have one or two nodes that have any kind of offset or lift gamma gain. Right? And they're like, no, you can't have more than that. I don't see any reason to not have as many as you want. I often have a lot. I find it very useful for myself to be able to toggle something on and off, and I especially find that clients like to see stuff being toggled off. They've made their note, they want to see the before and the after. Another thing I find very useful with doing that is, let's say I'm really struggling to match two shots because they're just so inherently different. Like, oh, I'm too warm. Oh, I'm too cool. Oh, like this perfect line is so thin and you can't hit it. And then I'm like, okay, let's go a bit too far, go into key, bring down the gain, and start to dissolve. I love this so much. Dissolve that node's opacity and with it the intensity of my correction. And that's how I'm going to get it. And I can't do that if it's in a node with something. So for that real fine tuning, I've got no problem with having lots and lots of notes. And then, of course, you get it right, and then you can apply it to the rest of your scene. But you don't want to get in a pickle. That's the other thing. And I think a lot of it, and again, the working with other colorists, working under other colorists, the experience of working on more projects. I mean, ideally, the aim of the game, I think, or the aim of my game, is developing a methodology, right? So that doesn't mean that you're doing the same thing on every show or in every shot. It's not, bunging a bullet grade on or like your version of a bespoke. But it's having some sense of process of how you approach something. I think this is really important for long form. And the more long the long form, for episodic, it's essential. I don't know how anyone could grade a series without having some kind of methodology. I think you get in a real pickle there. So, like, this is what I'm going to do if you're on Resolve on the group grade. This is what I'm going to do on my clip. My first note is my CBL. I often end up, especially on the higher budget shop stuff, even ending up with a kind of a no graph template. Once you've figured out what the client wants and what they tend to bump up against in the review, you know what they don't like about what's been shot, you even end up with like a bunch of turned off nodes, kind of doing the same things, which you turn on and off, or other things on Resolve I found really useful that tie into a methodology is there's this thing where you can preserve a number of nodes, right? So it means you can copy and paste grades, but you can save nodes, say 1 and 2, which is your CDO and your match. Or you can do it in your group, which is great. If your group is like your scene by scene. So I find figuring out where you want to put things, how you want to put them, because what you really don't want to be doing is spending time dragging and dropping nodes onto each individual shot, or getting into a pickle and you're like, oh, I did it in the group for this scene, but I did it on the clip. That scene, now the client wants it turning off. So it's all that kind of stuff.
Oh, I think that's so useful. That's the craft side of it, I think. And every colorist is going to have their own methodology, but you're in the process of refining yours.
Yeah, and with every show it changes. Every show, every person I work with, I feel like it deepens my understanding of an image. Like, on Under the Bridge, sometimes their eyes catch the lighting, the not the practical lighting, the set lighting, and it creates this really small but really intense, especially in HDR, kind of ping of light. I don't like that, and I was like, I hadn't noticed. But now you mention it, I'm like, yeah, it is better with that reduced. So then I'll go to the next HDR show, and if I see the same thing, I'm going to see it and I'm going to address it immediately. And other things like sometimes you feel so silly afterwards. You're like, how did I not notice this? But of course, you're just looking at, you're like, oh, does their skin tone match? You're not looking at what their eyeballs are doing. And one thing I noticed on another show is I'm lowering the contrast and my saturation's going down, but my client hasn't asked me to put the saturation up. So now I feel a bit like, am I allowed almost? If the no is not to take the contrast down and put the saturation up, is it rude, or are they going to be asking what I'm doing if I put the saturation back up? Then they go, oh, we've lost the saturation, let's put it up. And you're like, lovely. But then from that, I'm like, well, actually, hang on a minute. Maybe I should have a note prepared in my little gallery that both brings the contrast down and puts the saturation up, so the saturation stays exactly even. And then I can dissolve that on and off with my game. And that way, I've almost invented a new tool, because on Resolve, you can't, my knowledge anyway, do both at the same time, right? But then that's my tool which does both at the same time. And then you can end up with like this, almost like a gallery of these tools which you can jump to really quickly, and they're going to do exactly what you want. They're going to behave exactly how you want them, while you're in this live session.
Yeah, and when you are in the live session, I mean, I've just from my experience, I've used Resolve for close to 15 years, and I feel like when I'm on my own or with clients that I know really well, the tool disappears. But I did a film with a famous director, and all of a sudden I felt like a newborn baby, and everything I was clicking buttons wrong. I was like pressing the wrong thing on the control surface because I was nervous. And if you're working at that caliber all the time, I imagine that little toolkit, that power grade gallery or whatever it is really useful for doing those quick, confident, client reassuring moves, because like you don't want to move in any way that spooks
Yes,
them.
and
You've got to keep their confidence.
it's even more so when you're doing remote. So a lot of my grading is remote. I have Zoom, I have the iPad, and they can't see what's going on. Like, they can't see if it's crashed or a saving menu's come up or it's stuck in mode. Usually when someone's in the room, they're like, oh, okay, I'll give her a minute. It's doing something. It's fine. But when you're in the flow of a session, multiple people in the room in a hay or something, and you're like, not doing what I want it to do. And the panic can kick in pretty quickly, yeah.
And that's not an ideal point from which to make creative decisions, when I hate that feeling. And I think everyone's been there of like, oh my God, I just want to show the swan on top of the water and they can't see the legs, but the legs are going,
Yeah.
It's just not fun.
Yeah, you can always feel a bit worried. I mean, there's an element of, I guess, performance to a live session. How have you performed? Did that go well? Of course, the work's fine, but did the experience of that session hit where you wanted it to hit? And there is a lot to that, and sometimes you just get a day and everything seems to be stacked against you.
It does feel like that sometimes. I often feel like that if I'm having a technical problem. I remember recently I was in a session and I was meant to have a particular plugin licensed, but there was a problem with the license and there was so much backwards and forwards around that that I just couldn't focus on the creative and I couldn't even be that, fun person in the suite. And yeah, it can be a problematic
Yeah,
moment.
one thing I found different is, so when I first started, features and broadcast were two separate divisions, completely separate clients, separate DPs, separate colorists, almost at some point even within the whole Essence Deluxe company group, separate companies. Now it's long form, right? Episodic and features is pretty much together. It's long form. Colorists, clients, DPs, writers are moving through them. There's no barrier. But what I have found is still a very big difference is when I do episodic, generally speaking, I will grade the episode, then we review the episode. There's probably some look at right at the beginning, and then there's a little bit of time for some notes, and that's the episode finished. You go on to the next episode, and you do it over. Whereas with features, particularly indie features, if they've got a 40-hour package or they've got an 80-hour package, they want to be in that room for 40 or 80 hours. And I remember one of the things we spoke about was how in an ideal world you would balance a shot, then match your balance shots, and you then apply your grade. Because that way you're not a lot of it comes back to colour separation. You're not, what's the difference between a grade and a wash kind of thing. So a lot of what that means is, at least I found, that you end up doing all three of those at the same time in the same process. So you're doing your balance, your match, and your kind of look, and sometimes you're finishing as well. Kind of all in the same path with a live studio audience, which can feel quite high pressured at some times. But I think, again, that's just an experience thing and you just get used to it. Because, when I started out and I was sitting next to people who had been doing colour grading for 20 years and who had been doing finishing for 10 of those years, I mean, that was Monday, like that's just what they did day in, day out. Whereas for me, I went from, quite funny actually, I went from really struggling to grade without a client being next to me, to learning how to grade without a client next to me, now having to almost relearn, not in terms of the skill set, but kind of like the time management and I remembered that note, we'll jump to that, but I'm just going to finish the shot here kind of again.
I think everyone's going to relate to that. I think you've actually hit on a journey that a lot of people go through, right? Because there's a massive difference between putting on a podcast or putting on your favorite album, being snug in the room by yourself, you control the environment, you've got some snacks, it doesn't matter what your face is doing, doesn't matter what you're saying, you don't have to say anything. And you can just go right into those pictures and go for it. And if you want to get up and go to the loo, or if you want to walk around the block and refresh your eyes, you can. And then you bring the client in and it's a whole different ball game.
I didn't do it this year, which I actually really enjoyed it. So it was a bit disappointing. But last year I did something we have in Vancouver called Crazy 8. So it's a filmmaking competition, and what happens is people pitch their short film ideas, and the 8 winners get to make their films in, I think it's 8 days, which sounds like a lot, but they're like building sets and stuff. These are properly made films. Wow. And then people, like our companies, they get some funding and they get kind of gifted services. So I did 2 of them, and they were 2 short films between 5 and 7 minutes long. I had 4 hours to grade them. So 4 hours to grade one day, 4 hours to grade the other. Which would not be crazy, except you get 5 filmmakers come in and they're all sleep deprived and delirious because they've almost finished. And they've all got so many ideas. And honestly, the project's absolutely fantastic. I really, really love them. We ended up with 2 really, really good looking pieces of work. Those were crazy. Like, you literally got someone with, you're going to be disqualified if you don't stop. And, it should be blue, it should be red, it should be... So that was an experience.
That's fantastic.
And I kind of came out this week. And another colorist who previously was like, how was it? I was like, yeah, they're crazy.
Well, it's good to mix it up a bit. And I mean, working through the strikes and working on a bunch of indie projects and working on a bunch of shorts, I imagine that it gives you quite a breadth of experience that at other times perhaps you wouldn't be getting in that role.
Totally. I mean, totally. If it wasn't for like the crippling anxiety of destitution, I would have really enjoyed it. But no, it was a really good opportunity for me to do a much broader range of work. I mean, I was basically hired to increase capacity on episodic grading for what at the time was a streaming and was projected to be a continually exponentially growing streaming boom. So after I joined, about 2 months later, the boom ended. and then there were the strikes. So really what I'd signed up to do was to be doing, episodic shows, one episodic show after another episodic show. And what I ended up getting to do was to do 2 really phenomenal episodic shows and a bunch of features of very varying budgets, all the way from Big Fat Greek Wedding to, I'm trying to think what my lowest budget film was. I think it's probably Takes a Village, which is a documentary set in East Vancouver about a refugee Ugandan family growing up, which I think was sponsored by TELUS, and kind of everything in between. And yeah, again, you just learn something from every project and every person that I work with, especially DPs. Always learn something, and another little node goes in that gallery of something to pull out, and another kind of luck goes on the favourite list of like, okay, this is a good luck for this, but this is how I pray with that lot. So yeah, because I'd never done documentary before. That was the first documentary I'd ever done. Party Pirate had some sections of claymation. I've never graded animation. I've never graded animation literally into a live action scene. Like, it's the same scene. It's like, whoa, how do I do this? So I did benefit a lot, and also, I got to do some music videos and commercials. And I think one of the things that I really loved is one of the features I did, Valiant 1, which I think is going to be released this year. So it's set in North-South Peninsula, but was shot in BC. So it was quite a challenging grade, from making it look not only like a different country, but also completely different weather conditions, because they shot in BC thinking, well, we're guaranteed to be overcast and rainy. And it was like blistering heat wave. So it was a very challenging grade, but really phenomenal DP who actually shoots only on red, which is interesting because I feel like not a lot of people are shooting on red at the moment, or at least here what we're getting in Vancouver. And a very strong look. He's a commercial CP. So he came back with a couple of strikes. He came back with a couple of commercials during the strike, which were much appreciated and great. So I was like, "Hey, repeat client."
And so on that film where it was red, my understanding is that you created a bespoke LUT for that one using the red creative kit. What was that process
So it was
like?
quite interesting. So what happened was this was another LUT originally that had been done either by or for our dailies department, which I had inherited. But when I came, and the dailies looked absolutely fantastic. And it was originally going to be a HDR stream. So we would have just had a HDR version. But when I converted it to P3 and I looked at it in the theatre, by the time we came to grade, I wanted to be better. I was like, it just wasn't working. It was too heavy. You know, you can always add contrast in. It's very hard to kind of take it out, you know. And I was like, I love like how the LUT's going. It's too strong for the P3. So I took some advice, and again, this is one thing that's wonderful about working with a company like us, where you can knock on a suite and go to a colorist who's more senior than yourself. And I worked with an absolutely phenomenal colorist called Anne Boyle, and she looked at it and she went, "That's red creative. I reckon that's what." So we found the creative kit, and we were able to completely reconstruct the LUTs that have been made. Essentially like a base LUT and a bunch of input LUTs with different names. Some of them are touch odd. um, so we recreated it, and then I was able to adjust how much of each of these input LUTs and which base LUT these input LUTs were going on to create a more bespoke version of the LUT for the P3. But then also I could adjust it on a per scene basis as well.
Oh, what an amazing amount of control to have.
Unbelievable. I will now, actually, I did do another short which was red. Now I get any red project, I'm straight for that price. Because, you know, if I go to our imagery and science team, absolutely wonderful, and I go to them, I want a LUT that does this, this, and this, and this for red, they'll give me whatever I asked for, but I can't adjust it literally live in the room with on such on a scene by scene basis.
And to have that skill, which is more of a colour science skill, and you've brushed up against colour science your whole career and worked in very technical roles that have required understanding of it. And to be able to get hands-on with it and see how it can be like an actually creative solution to a problem as opposed to a bunch of like really scary formulas in a white paper.
Yeah, I think I still find it kind of scary. I've yet to meet anyone that I think has an equal handle on both the technical colour side of colour and then the subjective creative side of colour. You know, I think they're just fundamentally two different types of brain. I once considered, I was like, maybe I should become a colour scientist, and I think it lasted about one afternoon. That also goes along with when I decided I was going to learn how to use Python. That also lasted one afternoon. I was just like, it's not for me. But yeah, the necessity of needing to understand something in order to do what I want to do creatively seems to kind of push me through it. So I always say it's sort of my understanding of that extends as far as it needs to, and things not an inch more.
I think that's really practical though, because you've only got so many hours in the day and there's only so much bandwidth any one person has. And if you're really focused on your goal of being an incredible colorist, then going off and getting sidetracked becoming a color scientist is not necessarily going to get you
Yeah,
there.
I also think it's how you learn. So, like, if something's abstract, like I was trying to learn Python. It's like if you write this script, you'll be able to tell the time on this clock to go back by 10 minutes. Well, I don't want to. So, therefore, none of this is making any sense to me whatsoever. But if I actually wanted to do that, it would probably make enough sense that I would be able to do it.
But if Python was going to help you with that, you know, setting up your node graph or something really practical, I imagine you'd get
But if
in.
anyone can write Python and can write that, please message me on LinkedIn and we'll go for coffee and I'll buy it this time.
Well, there you go. You heard it here first. And if anyone in the Vancouver area feels like buying Aurora coffee, it sounds like you've got a potential
Yeah.
coffee date. So, can you tell me a little bit? I feel like I've taken a lot of your time up, and I will wrap things up quite
My
shortly.
first mentoring session I ever did was supposed to be half an hour and it lasted 3 hours, so don't worry.
Oh, they're so lucky. Um, well, I did want to just hear a little bit about. So, you've obviously done some amazing things, and since we last saw one another, you've been kicking huge goals and doing beautiful work. Now that the strikes are over and production's ramped up again, I know there's quite a few shows that you've graded that haven't been released yet, but I also imagine there's a huge amount of stuff coming up.
Oh, wow.
So, what are you excited for?
So the plan is I'm finishing Under the Bridge. Sweet Magnolias is coming back to me for season 4, which is a massive, massive privilege because it I think it's the first show that's come back to me rather than been given to me. You know, like it didn't have to come back to me and it did. So I'm hoping to manage as much of that as I can, and then I'm taking a year off to have a baby. That's what you do when you're at the top of your career.
Oh, well, that's so
Yeah.
awesome. Oh, congratulations. Oh, well, I don't even know what to say. I'm just so excited for
So
you.
yeah, so that's my next year. And we're hoping we'll probably be spending a chunk of it in Europe. Kind of that's where our family is. And maybe even a little bit of traveling while we do it. We'll see.
Oh, you always manage to squeeze a bit of travel in to
Holiday
every
into it.
adventure.
So yeah, that's very
Well,
exciting. And then yeah, I guess kind of after that, my slate is pretty blank, really. I guess I just have to hope that I've made enough good work now that it speaks for itself in a year and a bit's time.
yeah, look, it absolutely will. Talking as a mother of a 3-year-old now, when I came back from Vancouver, I was 7 months pregnant and I'd been away for about a year and a half. And I was like, oh my God, I'm about to take another 6 months off and everyone will have forgotten me. But, you know, as soon as I was back, everyone was ready to jump on again. And I think people actually love it when you're a little bit unavailable. I'm just so excited for you. And I'm all about the working mums.
Well,
It's fantastic.
we'll see how it goes. But I think it's very easy to always think of work in terms of work and only work. And I think when you're first starting out, kind of going all the way back to mentoring, when you're first starting out, it really is, because that's how you do it. You don't make something of your career by being 1 foot in and 1 foot out. You're all in. But at a certain point, life has to happen, or should happen, or otherwise it's like, well, what's the point in working hard? Enjoy it. Yeah.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, and when it comes to family, I just think, all of those previous generations' problems of, oh, I'm having a baby, so I can't have a career, they're gone now. And we can do both. So why not? Why not be happy in both areas? Well, I think that's a really nice point to wrap it up. I'm absolutely thrilled on all points. I'm so excited with the amazing career that you're making for yourself and watching the beautiful work that you're working on. And I think I'll talk to you offline about your mentoring, because I really back that.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. And thank you for listening if you've managed to get to the end of this.
Yes, thanks, guys. Thanks so much for joining me. And for Mixing Light, I'm Kaylee Bateman.